Hello and welcome to Principles of Economics. My name is Lance Vogt and I am your instructor, professor, whatever you want to call me for this course. And I wanted to give you an introduction to what economics is, where it comes from, what it's useful for, and kind of set the stage for our course moving forward. If you're taking principles of macroeconomics or principles of microeconomics, this is essentially the same introduction that you would get in either course, because there are some basic fundamentals that are important to know for both courses before you move forward into each specific subject's content. But hopefully, after this lecture, you'll have a good understanding of what it is that economics is about, and maybe you have a little bit more of an interest in pursuing it as a career. So just to set things up, each lecture is going to have a roadmap of what we're going to discuss in that lecture. So first off, we're going to start our class by talking about scarcity. Then we're going to define what economics is. Then we're going to talk about something called the dismal science. It's basically a moniker that's been given to economists, and we're going to explore why it was given that title and whether or not it's really a good name for it in the first place. We'll then dig into what decision-making principles are important for optimizing behavior. We'll talk about efficiency, which is one of the goals of economists. We'll talk about the difference between positive and normative economics. We'll talk about economic models, and then we'll finish by talking about kind of the economic organizational structures, so to speak, that basically define how resources are distributed in various countries around the world and the legal framework that allows for markets to exist, which will set the stage up for our discussion of trade and supply and demand moving forward. So I like to start class by talking about something unique, different, that you might not think of as applying to economics. And so I want to ask you, can you learn about economics from a kid's game show? And I argue that you can't. So in the 1990s, there was actually a reboot. I think it might have been on Netflix, but streams changed, so it might be somewhere else nowadays. There was a game show called Legends of the Hidden Temple. And so basically, it was a game where kids would do these kind of athletic tasks that were supposedly in the jungle, even though it was like a TV studio. And they would basically try to outplay, out athletic, outwit, kind of like Kid Survivor, other teams of two. So there were different teams with different shirt colors, and they'd have different challenges. They were swinging from ropes, they were kayaking, swimming, climbing stuff. And then if you beat all the other teams, then you would get one final challenge. And in that final challenge, this big giant stone head by the name of Olmec, as you can see on the screen here, would basically tell you that there was a maze that you had to complete. You had to retrieve some sort of item, some hidden relic from the temple. You had to evade these guards that had some potentially culturally inappropriate outfits. And you had to decide whether or not which route you were going to take to try and make it back in time. But before those kids went into the temple, potentially to never return, Olmec would always give them this one piece of advice.
The choices are yours and yours alone.
Yes, the choices are yours and yours alone. And so, why am I talking about this? Well, the reason why I'm talking about this is because of the fact that economics, the entire discipline, is about making choices. But why? And the reason why is because of scarcity. And scarcity is the situation where we have unlimited wants that exceed the limited resources available to fulfill those wants. Even if we had all the money in the world, which we might learn if you're taking macroeconomics, isn't as concrete of of a value as you might associate, since it seems like your entire world revolves around money. Even if you had all the natural resources that you could have, you might be confined by the amount of space you have. But even if you have enough space, you can go out into the universe. You're still limited by time and the finiteness of your faculties and your physical ability for now. Maybe we'll have some innovations in the future that allow for that to be extended, but regardless, we still have some sort of limitation on ourselves in the form of time. So we're always dealing with scarcity, no matter how rich we are, how poor we are. We're always dealing with it in some way, shape, or form. And as a result, we have to make choices. And so that's where economics comes in. How do we analyze those choices? How do we figure out what's best for us? And so even though Olmec might not have thought of himself as an economist, he, in my eyes, is an economist for telling us and telling young kids trying to go to space camp that the choices are yours and yours alone. And the question then becomes, how do we make good choices? And so that's where economics comes.
The choices are yours and yours alone.
Thank you, Olmec. So, economics. There's a lot of definitions that you might find online that tell you different things, but essentially, economics is the study of resources and human behavior through a prism of scarcity. So, when we say we're studying resources, we're basically saying how are they going to be distributed, and we're going to discuss how humans behave and make choices. And why do they have to make those choices? Because of scarcity. So what's a prism? So if you're into music, you might have heard of Pink Floyd. They had an album called Dark Side of the Moon, or maybe you've in science class seen basically like a pyramid of glass that basically scatters and refracts light source in out as kind of a rainbow. That's basically what economics does. It takes a choice that you're trying to make, a question you're trying to ask, and it runs it through basically this prism of scarcity and economic tools that allow for you to scatter off and answer the question in a bunch of different ways depending on what field of economics you're in. But economics is basically considered a social science. So, social sciences, you might consider sociology or maybe psychology, maybe some people might consider philosophy. Humanities are a social science. Some people might consider history a social science. Uh, what constitutes a social science varies based on definitions, but at its core, economics is kind of like definitely a social science because of the fact that it follows the scientific method. So the scientific method is basically, okay, I have a question, I gather some research, I maybe can form a testable hypothesis, I generate the experiment, and then I let it run, and then I analyze the results. Well, if you take like a natural science like chemistry or biology or physics or something like that, you may be able to create what we call a randomized controlled experiment where you can basically isolate every single little detail or make it the same. So you have a control and then you have your variable, and basically you can identify the specific relationship between two things because you kept everything else the same. The problem is in the social world, aka with humans, we can't really do that. We can try to create experiments, and there is some horror stories in the past about experiments that we've tried to um, undertake, such as like the Stanford prison experiment and Tuskegee and stuff like that, that has really kind of allowed for us to modernize our institutional review boards and stuff like that that allow for us to have more safe research. And so as a result, we kind of can't really force people to do that. So instead, what we do is we collect data on them, and then we try to use mathematical tools to back out that relationship. And we'll get to that at the end of this lecture regarding economic models. But economics is typically focusing on how we apply resources and how we can achieve optimal goals, both at an individual level and an economy-wide level. So if it's an individual level, you're in microeconomics world. If it's economy-wide, you're at macroeconomics world. But the prism in which we evaluate is what allows for us to define the different branches of economics. So this little rainbow pattern here is basically the different fields of macroeconomics. But again, we're filtering the light through scarcity. And so what do economists do to allow for us to basically get some useful information and answer questions within this context of scarcity? Well, economics at its base is a toolkit. So historically, it might have started from an area of political economy or history or philosophy or something like that. And in some ways, economics is a philosophy, but we just follow it so much mindlessly through market systems. We don't really see it as a philosophy. We kind of see it as something real and reality, but in a way, we've created that reality for ourselves. It can still be a philosophy. Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Malthus, we might consider them economists now, but they were not considered economists back in the 17th and 18th centuries and 19th centuries because economics didn't exist at that point. But anyways, economists today usually have a toolkit of math, statistics, critical thinking, problem solving, logic, and the scientific method. And so if you are a scientist or you're an engineer, a lot of those people will come and gravitate towards economics mid-career or early career if the job prospects don't work out, because it's a similar toolkit of problem solving and critical thinking, but instead through the lens of scarcity and through the lens of human behavior rather than maybe some sort of like physics problem or chemistry problem. And so again, that rainbow pattern basically is indicating the different fields of economics. So you might think of economics as just strictly about money right now or supply and demand. That's perfectly okay. We'll get into the different areas in a little bit, and we'll dig into those topics a little bit more in the courses. But before we even get to that, we need to see how broad economics expands itself to. So the two major branches are macroeconomics and microeconomics. Macroeconomics, so if you're taking principles of macroeconomics, after these basic lectures of supply and demand and trade and introductions and decision making, you're going to basically be learning about the economy from an aggregate level. So we're going to basically be looking at a country level view of economic performance and policy and measurements. So since this course is being given in the United States, that focus will be on the United States. But with the exception of maybe the different institutions that administer these policies, a lot of these principles, if you're not from the United States, can be applied to your respective country. So if you're in Europe or in Japan or in Canada, you will probably have a much similar interpretation and policy making body in your country that will allow for you to follow along with this material. However, if you're in microeconomics, you basically will be studying individual decision-making units. So that can be a person, that can be a business, that can be an entire market. So the market, which we'll get to a little bit today and more in future lectures, is going to be the institution that is kind of the largest level of microeconomics and the smallest level of macroeconomics. So afterwards, you're going to zoom out for macroeconomics. For microeconomics, you're going to zoom in. But those are the two major branches. But on the right-hand side, we have a bunch of different categories. We have public economics, we have international trade, we have labor, we have environmental, we have agricultural, industrial organization, which is basically talking about like how big or small an industry should be to optimize, econometrics, which is basically applied statistics and math within the context of economics, sports economics, political economics, so political economy, economic geography, economics of education, law and economics, and so much more. All of the categories that are highlighted in green are actually papers or projects that I've done in those fields within my economic career. The interesting thing is that I only learned one set of tools to do all of that different research. It's just that I took the tools that I had, a broad-based set of tools, and applied it to a bunch of different categories. So those categories are going to allow for us to be able um, to basically find the interest that we have in our research and answer questions related to it. So in undergrad, I did a paper about interest rates. In grad school, I did a paper about predicting enrollment at a college. In a different grad school program, um, I studied wildfire impacts on national parks. In law school, I did a paper on basically economic principles of supply and demand and how they would affect trademark litigation. So all of this is from the same tool set and a curiosity for questions that are out there in the world. And the same is true for you. If you have like an economics degree, you can kind of pivot into whatever area and field you're interested in. You just kind of will lean into finding research projects related to that area. And then when it comes to sports, I, in the past, ran a sports analytics website. It doesn't exist anymore. It might exist in the future. But for right now, I was doing basically college football predictions and um, baseball trade outcomes and projections in basketball and stuff like that. So it was kind of before this revolution with data and analytics in sports. So nowadays there's actually conferences where people are doing way more sophisticated stuff than I ever did. But at the time when I was doing it, it wasn't really that in the know and in the forefront and in the mainstream, even with the teams. And now they actually hire people that just do analytics stuff for general managers, for coaches behind the scenes. So back in the day, used to be you were a video editor to be a basketball or football coach. You would cut up all the film and basically take clips out to basically help for scouting. Now it's all with numbers. So, whatever you have an interest in, there's probably some field of economics that is related to it. So, don't just think it's about money. Don't just think it's about politics. In fact, most people in social sciences outside of economics think of economics as political economy, communism, capitalism, some sort of ism. But in reality, economics looks at it from a market-based perspective in our field, and we don't even really dig too much into political economics in these principles courses. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't political things to discuss in the course. It just means that it's not kind of the dominating figure within the course where it might be in, say, a geography, sociology, history, anthropology type class. Now, economics has also been called the dismal science. And a lot of times people associate that term with the fact that economists are usually having to make tough decisions based on the scarce resources that are available to them. And so whatever they recommend is going to sound horrible if it's an impossible outcome to kind of make everybody happy. And so a lot of people just think, okay, well, then that kind of makes sense. But the real original misnomer was that back in, I think, the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was this British man by the name of Thomas Carlyle. And the belief was that Thomas Malthus, which is the first sunglass gentleman on the left in the bottom of the slide, um, basically kind of inspired Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection by saying that there is only so many resources out in the world. He basically identified scarcity, said there's only so many resources. So at the end of the day, we have one Earth. We only have so many resources. So eventually, we're going to get to the point where we're not going to have enough for everybody. As we've kind of moved forward with our understanding of the world and geography and travel and all this other stuff, we we do have scarce resources, but what is making it worse is that they're not evenly distributed. So maybe there's actually enough resources for everybody in the world right now, but they're not evenly distributed because there is different geographies with different abundances and different shortages. And distributing those resources around the world is better than it used to be, which is why globalization has become kind of one of the more popular approaches to economics and business over the past 50, 60 years. But at the end of, but it's still not perfect. And so that would make sort of sense if that was the reason why it was called the dismal science, that we don't want to think about the fact that there's not enough stuff for everybody to be happy. That's not pleasant. But what it actually turns out, and if you click on the link in the slide, it'll take you to kind of the research behind this and the story behind this. John Stuart Mill, another philosopher who is the aviator's gentleman on the right in the bottom of the screen, basically was in support of resource distribution being more efficient for the world's kind of standard of living to go up, that we should emancipate slaves. We should get rid of slavery, allow for them to earn their own keep. And that will allow for more people in the market, more competition, and allow for resources to be more evenly distributed. And that was what Thomas Carlyle had a problem with. Thomas Carlyle had a problem with ending slavery as kind of a uh, bourgeoisie type of British person in the 19th century, 18th century. So, what that means is the reason why economics is called the dismal science is because we are the OG abolitionists. So, if that's what it takes to be the dismal science, then so be it. So, as the gentleman in the top of the slide said, they did have us in the first half, not gonna lie, but it turns out that we were right all along as economists. So, moving forward, when it comes to economics and making choices, we're trying to come up with the best choice. Not every choice is going to be right. Not every choice is going to be perfect. There's trial and error. But at the end of the day, there's usually going to be a higher probability, a higher chance that you're going to make the right decision if you follow these three principles. So the first principle is that people weigh the benefits and costs of their actions. So you might have heard of a cost benefit analysis. If people weigh the benefits and costs of their actions, then if the benefits outweigh the costs, then they probably do it. If not, then they probably don't do it. Now, if they're not quite sure, then people might respond to strong economic incentives where, okay, you're not quite sure because it might be too expensive. Well, then someone gives you a discount or someone gives you a coupon, or you don't want to help out with something and someone gives you free pizza or something like that that convinces you, okay, I'll do it. But once you've decided to do something, it's not necessarily sufficient to just say, yes, I'm going to do it or no, I'm not. And that's where marginal analysis helps us. That's what helps us find kind of like the ideal sweet spot of the activity that we're interested in engaging in. So when we weigh the benefits and costs of our actions, one thing that people fail to recognize more often than not is something called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the highest valued alternative that must be given up in order to engage in an activity. And so what that means is every time you make a choice, there's other things that you could choose to do instead of the thing that you chose to do. So when your alarm clock goes off of the morning, you can either decide to hit the snooze button, keep sleeping. You could choose to get up and go to work. You can choose to get up and go to the gym. You can choose to get up and eat breakfast. There's a bunch of things. You go play video games. There's a lot of options that you have that you can do with that time. Obviously, there's pros and cons to all of them, and you'll probably choose the one that's of the highest value to you. So if it's like, okay, well, if I don't go to work, I get fired, and then I can't live in I have no bed to sleep in because I won't be able to make my rent anymore, then you probably are like, okay, well, then I guess I'll go to work even though I don't really want to, because you're looking at the cost benefit analysis. But the thing is that there's always an opportunity cost associated with your activity. So let's say you want to go to a concert, or a movie instead of working on a Friday night or something like that. Well, you might focus on the actual spending of money. You might focus on, okay, I'm going to buy tickets and I'm going to pay for dinner and I'm going to drive. And if it's a concert, there might be parking, there might be gas costs. And then you count up all of the dollars and cents that you're spending on that stuff, while also failing to acknowledge that your highest valued alternative in that case is working. And so if your highest valued alternative is to work, well, then the money that you're giving up is also part of that cost as well. So let's say you're going to make $150. Well, then you got to add that on to know what the total cost is of going to that concert or that movie. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. So I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, well, that $150 is a lot of money and you shouldn't ever enjoy your life because you got to make money. I'm not that type of person. It just becomes harder to quantify the value of things. And if you take microeconomics and you go through the whole course, you'll learn about utility theory and optimizing utility. And utility is kind of our way of, if we could measure it, it's our way of measuring happiness. And so the thing is like going to the concert is going to make you happy. Eating good food is going to make you happy. Sleeping is going to make you happy. Listening to music is going to make you happy. But the question is we have to kind of pick and choose our battles. Okay, well, one day it might be better, one day it might not be. And so those are the things that we're doing on a daily basis, but we're not really quantifying it in our heads. We're just kind of going off of gut instinct. But at the end of the day, if that concert is like a once in a lifetime experience and the memories are going to be something you're never going to forget, and you were going to quit that job anyway next week and start a new one, well, then that should be enough reason to go. So I'm not here to be risk averse and say, oh, well, like everything that isn't making you money is not valuable. That's not true at all. In fact, I think we need more belief of being able to kind of value and quantify that time that we need to be able to enjoy our lives instead of just working. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, we don't have that luxury. We're in survival mode. We got bills to pay. We got to keep the lights on. We got to keep a roof over our heads. We got mouths to feed. And so, unfortunately, we don't necessarily get the luxury or the benefit to be able to make those choices as often as we wish we could. But at the end of the day, don't forget that that's still something that needs to be important in order for you to have kind of like a richly textured life. Now, going back to kind of this cost benefit analysis independent of opportunity cost, because opportunity cost is very important when we're making decisions, because most people forget about it and they'll make their choice without factoring that in. And then maybe that opportunity cost would have been the difference between them doing it and not doing it. However, this is where I kind of differ a little bit from traditional economists. Economists believe in this thing called rationality or rational actors, where when they're trying to create economic models that are simplified but robust, what they will do is they will just assume that every human is a robot and consistent and not hypocritical and not messy, and then basically just do what they can to make their life as good as possible. The thing is that a lot of us think we're doing that, but we aren't because we don't know all the costs, so we don't know all the benefits, so we make poor choices a lot or non imperfect choices a lot. And so the question then becomes, can we still accept this concept of rationality, even if we aren't quote unquote rational as it is in terms of optimizing our lives? And I think the answer is yes. The answer is yes, because when you subjectively decide that the benefits outweigh the costs, the outcome is going to be based off of you engaging in that activity. So there could be instances where the risk is high and the reward is low, or the reward is high and the risk is high, but you didn't know the risk was as high or the reward was as low. But if it works out for you, you'll never know that it was a bad choice. And that might have made your life better, whereas you might not have made that choice if you would have known all of the things you were getting yourself into. So at the end of the day, I still think it's rational. And the reason why it's rational is because of the fact that a lot of the problems that we have in society are because of the fact that we ignore the decisions that people make with imperfect information. So a lot of times we might think something is irrational when it actually might be rational in terms of how I define it. And honestly, if we actually thought about it that way, we might actually be more likely to make better change in our society. So let's take the example of maybe someone who's addicted to drugs or and robs a bank. Okay? The reason why people rob banks is typically because they're desperate for money and they need some sort of short-term amount and they know they're going to get caught. So we think of like Ocean's 11 where they're heisting casinos and stuff like that. No, it's usually just a person that goes into a bank, makes a threat, gets a small amount of money, and what they're doing with that money is anybody's guess. It could be to buy drugs, it could be to buy stuff for family members while they're outside of jail for a little bit of time, because oftentimes people that rob banks are recidivists, which means they're repeat offenders. And so if we looked at it from the perspective of those people are irrational, we need to punish them and we need to make jail sentences 20 years for robbing banks. If you look at bank robberies, they're often nonviolent and they usually only get away with on an average $1,500 and they usually get caught right away. So most banks don't freak out too much about it. Of course, it would be shocking if you were the clerk and you saw that someone was brandishing a weapon. I'm not downplaying that severity. But if the goal of society is to diminish the amount of bank robberies, punishing someone for 20 years does not necessarily make them any less likely to rob the bank. In fact, it's going to have zero effect on the person that profiles as a common bank robber. So if we take the rationality principle of subjectively looking at it from the benefits and costs, even if we don't know costs that we otherwise might not make the same decision if that was the case, that is going to result in us being able to come up with a solution that actually looks at it from the perspective of the person robbing the bank. And then we can decide what is the incentive, which we'll get to in a second, that defines and governs why they make that decision. And then finally, we come up with a policy that allows for us to try and mitigate that behavior. So if the goal is to lower robbing banks or bank robberies because you're worried about it, It shouldn't be to increase the sentencing and punishment, because if you look at the profile of the person that typically robs a bank, they're not going to be deterred by prison time because they're probably going to prison anyway for something else. And the reason why they're going back is probably because we haven't rehabilitated them in some way, shape, or form. So if we look at it from the perspective, okay, well, what can we do to rehabilitate that person to try and mitigate their risk factors in the future? That's a better use of our taxpayer money, and that's a better use of our time to try and understand how things change. So what I ask you is, what is a behavior that you consider irrational? And then think about why that's the case. Because a lot of times we live in bubbles, and those bubbles allow for us to basically think about things from a perspective of, well, what I'm used to, and those people are others, and I wouldn't ever do that. Well, then why are we looking at it from your perspective? You're never going to do it in the first place. Then why should we base it off of what your experience is? And we should focus on the actual thing that we're trying to solve. So rationality, I think, exists, and I think it needs to be considered in order for us to make better decisions in public policy. But it doesn't necessarily match up with the historical definition of what rationality is. So let me know if you agree or disagree with that. But speaking of incentives, there's a book by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner, both Stevens, so pretty easy to remember, called Freakonomics, and it's a series now, and it's a podcast now. In fact, I would encourage you to listen to some episodes of the podcast. It's something I actually listen to. The person that runs the podcast is not an economist, but he spent so much time around economists and the economic way of thinking that he is a very good, probably economist in his own right. Maybe not doesn't do the research, but through his journalistic interviewing, he basically has kind of created an anthology of economic understanding for a lot more people. And that's kind of just as important as doing some sort of PhD level research at a university that nobody reads. So, um, people respond to strong economic incentives. So, as you can see on the right, this car made a quick, swift exit because instead of just doing everything as normal, they were incentivized by money and free stuff. That's oftentimes what we get incentivized. So, why do people want lower taxes? Because it's more money for them. Why are people more likely to go to college if you give it to them for free than not? Because then it lowers the cost of going. Doesn't make it free because there's an opportunity cost of time and energy and stuff like that, but it makes it more likely for them to engage in that activity. So incentives are a catalyst. So if you're familiar with chemistry at all or enzymes and stuff like that, basically a catalyst speeds up a reaction. So you might have ended up making the same decision anyway to do something, but what incentives do is they basically allow for you to kind of just make a snap decision about it. Like, okay, well, I might have done it, but if you're gonna make all this extra benefit for me or extra cost for me, well, then it isn't worth it or it is worth it now. So that's why I liken them to catalysts because they basically speed up your decision-making process to be more definitive about whether you're going to do it or not. And incentives can be encouraging, so laws are ways to discourage behaviors, as we were just talking about. But incentives can encourage you. So a lot of us think about it from like coupons and discounts and bribes and tax cuts and all this other stuff. But the reality is that incentives and disincentives are working the same way, but in opposite directions. So in order for us to really understand how this impacts somebody, which goes back to that rationality decision-making principle I was talking about before. We have to look at it through the lens of the person making the choice, not through our lenses. Because if we don't, then we might inject bias into the decision. And in order for it's already hard enough to answer questions without bias, add bias in, and it becomes darn near impossible. So um, incentives, though, are basically kind of the main building block. It's not. It's believed to be one of the main building blocks. I don't think it's the main building block, like the number one thing, but it does allow for us to better understand people who aren't quite sure what the value proposition is to better understand the value proposition. That's why I think incentives are kind of overvalued a little bit because what it creates as a benefit is it allows for us to see what might allow for someone to make a decision, but it's because of the fact that they weren't seeing the value as clearly. So this is just a way for them to clarify the value, but they might have gotten to that decision anyway. We just weren't patient enough to let them figure it out for themselves without the incentive. So the last key decision-making principle has to do with marginal analysis. Now, when you hear about the term marginal or marginalized populations, you might think of people that are forgotten, ignored, things like that, pushed to the edge, pushed to the limits. But when we talk about marginal in economics, marginal means like the most important aspect of a decision because it's not just enough to say yes or no. It doesn't have to just be some binary, oh, I'm going to go work out or I'm not, because you don't know how much is going to be right. So if I go to the gym and I just stand on a treadmill and I don't turn it on, that's not really going to be an effective decision. But if I turn on the treadmill, how fast do I go? How long do I uh go for at that speed? Do I increase the speed? Do I lower the speed? Do I raise the resistance? Do I raise the elevation? There's a million questions that I have to answer. And in normal everyday life, that is usually done through a trial and error type process. But at the end of the day, businesses use marginal analysis to figure out what is the way we could maximize profits. For you, you can do the same. What is going to maximize my utility? What is going to be the best amount for me? So when we look at this, we basically focus on something called marginal benefit, which is the benefit of doing one more of something. So producing one more unit of a product, running one more mile, eating one more slice of pizza. Compare that to the marginal cost of doing the same thing. And once you've gotten to the point where the additional benefit and additional cost are balancing each other out, that means that all of the possible profits, gains, benefits that you could get from that have been exhausted, and you should stop there. So going back to economics sort of being called a dismal science and focusing on scarcity, naturally when we have a scarce resource, we don't want to waste it. So it should make sense that we focus on efficiency in economics. So there are two types of efficiency within the market system that we focus on. The first one is allocative efficiency, which basically means that there's a one-to-one relationship between what is produced and what is consumed. We don't want to overproduce, we don't want to underproduce. We want basically a Goldilocks situation where it's just right, where the amount of stuff we're producing matches up with the consumption levels. So that way there are resources that are there for another day for when we need it in the future. We don't want to be wasting everything and exhausting all our resources now and wasting product because we only have so much to go around. And that's what usually creates what we call efficient markets, and maximizes usually welfare from a overall dollars and cents perspective. But it doesn't necessarily result in equitable distribution of that benefit. So a lot of people who focus on economics, they only focus on, okay, well, the market being in equilibrium is efficient and that's what's best for everybody. But if the market system created $20 billion in benefit and it only went to one person, and instead it made $19 billion and distributed it across a million people, the graph will tell you that the $20 billion to one person is better for society. But the problem is that that goes to one person where nobody else gets anything else. Whereas if we lose $1 billion, but we gain it distributed out to a million people, it goes a lot further in terms of uplifting kind of the tide of all the boats. Um, so equity and efficiency, even though our graphs will look pretty and tell us, okay, this is the best. It doesn't mean it's the best for everybody. And then the other type of efficiency is productive efficiency. So that's producing goods and services at the lowest possible cost. Now, you might be thinking, well, producing things at the lowest possible cost usually results in junk that doesn't last, doesn't work, doesn't provide the same. It isn't made like it used to be, this, that, the other thing. When we talk about productive efficiency, it's usually considered in a competitive market space. So what that means is that if you produce goods and services at the same level of quality that the market demands at the lowest possible cost, then you're maximizing your profits. You're using the fewest amount of resources, you're spending the least amount of money, so when you sell it, you end up getting as much money as you possibly can out of it. And it also allows for there to be more resources for other people. Usually means it's cheaper for consumers as well. So basically everybody wins. The problem is that when you see junk being created, it's usually a non-competitive market. It's usually a monopoly or an oligopoly, only a few people in the space. And so they're focused on keeping others out and maintaining a healthy profit, even with competition in front of them. And so at that point, that productive efficiency isn't happening anymore. And so you have to realize that there is a difference between what this is saying. This is saying that we maintain the same level of quality at the lowest possible cost because there's a lot of competition versus, oh, there's not a lot of competition. And so we're just going to make junk because what are you going to do? Buy somebody else's? There's nobody else to buy from. And so a lot of people don't like economics because we make too many assumptions and we focus too much about efficiency. We don't focus up enough about equity, which is the fair distribution of economic benefits. But I'm here to tell you that that's not true. Economists will basically come up with scenarios and iterations and simulations that basically tell you, okay, this is the most efficient solution. But this is not quite the most efficient solution, but it's way more equitable and the wealth is shared more. Um, and so it's really up to the public to decide what's best. Do we value efficiency more? Do we value equity more? Do we try to find some balance between the two? That is where the public discourse, voters, public servants, that's where your role comes in to decide what's most important to your community, to your country, to the world. So if there's something that you identify or perceive as an inequity, think about it. What is a solution that you recommend for that inequity? And uh, we can talk about whether that's viable or not, whether it's with me or with other classmates or just people in your community. There are two approaches to economics. The first one is positive economics. So when I was younger, I haven't watched it so much, but I know the show still reruns on TV sometimes. There's a show called How It's Made, and basically How It's Made was a show where there was a factory and they would show you how like hot dogs were made and M&Ms were made and baseballs were made and stuff like that, where it was kind of really fascinating how like kind of we took the industrial revolution and assembly line approach to things and how we can just make like billions of things with machines that might have been done by hand 100 years ago. Just super fascinating stuff. That is why I got into economics, not because of the TV show. I got into economics because I believed that there was a curiosity about the world that I wasn't going to get from just choosing one field. If I was considering biology and I was considering chemistry and I was considering English, and none of those were enough to really satisfy me in terms of understanding the world. I appreciate everything that all of those fields have, but it was too in one direction. So if you go through this class and you see me referring to catalysts and you're referring to like Darwin and stuff like that, it's because of the fact that as an economist, you basically get to take all of the knowledge that you've acquired throughout your life and you get to apply it to anything you want. As long as you have a broad-based tool set that you learn in economics, you can basically ask any question and get close to an answer. You might not get there, but you can get close to the answer. And so positive economics is basically the approach where we don't know what the heck is going on. We just want to know what's going on. We just want to figure out why something is happening, how something works. We're just curious. We have a curiosity or an inspiration for a topic, but we don't actually know what the outcome is going to be. And so what that does is it allows for us to kind of be generally unbiased with how we're approaching it and basically help kind of uncover knowledge that might not have been there before. And so that's where most economic questions come from. Sometimes they are created from governments asking questions, businesses asking questions where they're saying, okay, like we need to change something, but how do we change it? What's the best option? So they might give us a few options, or we might create a few options, and then we evaluate those options. Are they good? Are they bad? So normative economics is that approach where we analyze outcomes, we evaluate them, and we might prescribe a recommendation. What should it be? The problem is that a lot of people think normative economics is just opinions, and it's not. We have actually quite a few, unfortunately, people in academics that have agendas. And what they do is they take the agenda that they have, they reverse engineer numbers to make it look right, and then they publish it in a journal, and then they say, hey, look, like this is bad or this is good, and or maybe they're being financed by some lobby group or something like that to kind of like carry the torch and say, well, I'm an economist and I'm saying this, so therefore it's true. Like normative economics should never even get to that point. It should always start from a place of positive economics, of curiosity and understanding. Because once you start putting agendas into things, um, it just poisons the knowledge that you're or the results that you're going to get. Like you can't trust them anymore. They're biased. And you can't really work with this. This kind of comes from a journalistic perspective. So you might think nowadays, haha, journalism, like there's no honor in that. But the thing is that when I was uh, in my freshman year of college, I took a journalism class and we watched All the President's Men with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And basically they were the people that uncovered Watergate through the Washington Post. And really they just had a kind of undying thirst for the truth. They didn't know what they were going to find, but they knew they needed to find it. And they put themselves in danger because there's people of power and trying to hold people of power to account. And so, unfortunately, in this social media storm that we live in nowadays, it's very hard for us to be able, if you don't already have the acquired knowledge, and even if you do, it's hard for us to stay vigilant and focused on the prize and not get emotionally pulled into things because of a video or a politician or something like that. And so the reality is that if you're an academic and you want to find the answer, you got to block the noise out. Because if you don't block the noise out, then the answer that you get is going to be, as they call it, garbage in, garbage out. And so this approach to economics, it can be approached to any form of science, any form of research, anything. So if you're a journalist, you got to be curious, but you also got to take yourself out of the middle, out of the story or agenda out of it. You might end up with a um, result that kind of verifies your personal beliefs, but that doesn't mean that that's what is ruling throughout the process. So I'll give you an example of this. I did a paper on wildfires and how they impacted national park revenues in gateway communities. So like there's a couple of towns that you would stay in if you were going to go to Yellowstone or you were going to go to the Smoky Mountains or something like that. There's towns that if you're familiar with national parks that basically serve as quote unquote gateway communities where they're like the last town with hotels and amenities and grocery stores before you go into the park and its wilderness and stuff like that. Now, some parks have amenities, but most of them are just empty space with wildlife and roads and campsites. I was basically trying to create a climate model, and the first step I needed to do was to just do one research project to determine whether that actually had an impact or not. So rather than just assuming it did, I just did the research, and I thought it did. I thought it would have a significant financial impact, wildfires on national park revenues. So what I did is I did a project where I basically identified the most extreme cases, the most invasive cases, and I estimated the economic impact. And so in its worst season, Yellowstone was impacted by a wildfire by, I believe, about 18 to 30 million dollars. Yes, a wide range, but the numbers are super noisy. So it was between 18 million and 30 million dollars. However, it turns out that the year-to-year variation of Yellowstone Gateway community revenue is like 30 to 50 million dollars. More likely closer to 50, maybe even sometimes 80 million. So what that means is that even though I measured a dollar impact that seems significant, it's small enough where it could be just normal year-to-year variation for Yellowstone itself. So I could not conclude that wildfires had an impact, even though I thought they did. And had I gone in just assuming that that was true, I might have messed up the research. And now it creates more research for me. So when you're looking at doing research, when you're looking at being an economist, when you're looking at trying to find truth, so if truth matters to you in some way, shape, or form, it's not just a feeling, it's not just whatever TikTok or whatever social media exists nowadays or in the future when you're listening to this exists. Um, you have to be vigilant and you have to look for resources on your own. You can't just accept. It's a complicated world out there. We're busy people. We've got a lot going on, and it's even more on top of everything else to have to be vigilant with this stuff. But if you want to be an informed citizen, unfortunately, you can't be lazy in your knowledge acquisition. So don't ask ChatGPT or whatever generative AI systems in the future when you're listening to this are the popular of the day because of the fact that um, they might not be telling you everything you need to know. So I might have said the word models a bunch in this lecture, and that's because economists basically create economic models. Now, in this class, whichever one you're taking, graphs are going to be your models. They're going to be visual aids that allow for you to kind of intuitively see what's happening between one variable and another. So the first ones you'll get are the production possibilities frontier and supply and demand graphs. And those will help you understand how demand and supply work with each other, how they interact with each other, how they change, etc. in a easy to read graph. Doesn't mean it's super easy. It just means that it's way easier when you can see it and kind of like physically move things versus just kind of like thinking about it as a concept in your head or with numbers. But this is how economists work. We can't just run a perfect experiment that definitively tells us the answer to something because people are doing a million things all at once. They're just living their lives and being crazy and making mistakes and stuff like that. So, in order for us to do that, what we have to do is we have to take data that's left behind by them and create an economic model using math. And that math allows for us to basically identify distinct relationships between things. The one key principle that we have to keep in mind when we do these economic models in math is we have to use a Latin phrase. So that Latin phrase is called ceteris paribus. It means all else equal. And it basically allows for us to hold everything else constant. So if there's 5 things that we think are impacting something, we hold 4 of them constant and we look at the relationship between the 5th thing and the thing that we're interested in. And what that allows for us is we allows for us to distinctly see the relationship between the 2 things. because we want to make sure that if something is related to another thing, it's a causal relationship, meaning X is causing Y, and not just some coincidence that's unrelated. So ceteris paribus is the thing that will always be working on in the background. When we do supply and demand, you'll be thinking about ceteris paribus. If you're looking at macroeconomic models, it's going to be ceteris paribus. There's always going to be something held constant to allow for us to look at the relationship between two things because our brains can't really comprehend more than two things at a time. Because if you add in a third thing, it can have impact on both things. It can have an impact on one thing, so you can't definitively conclude that those two things are related. So with the ceteris paribus assumption, another key principle to take in note of is correlation does not imply causation. So again, we're looking for causal relationships. Causation means that one variable is causing another variable to change. So if I kick a soccer ball, my foot X caused Y, the soccer ball, to move because I kicked it. It's not a correlation would be the ball went into the goal. Okay, well, did the ball go into the goal because I kicked it? Did the ball go into the goal because I kicked it and someone redirected with their head? Did the ball go into the goal because I kicked it and then the wind, there was like a hurricane that blew in and even though I was kicking it to the other direction, it blew it into my own goal? Correlations do not tell us the whole story. So while we can causally conclude that I kicked the ball, we can't conclude that it went in the goal because I kicked it. And so there's a website by Tyler Vigen or Vigen. I'm sorry, I don't know his correct pronunciation. But he's really popular kind of in the math and stats and science space because he creates what are known as spurious correlations. They're basically graphs that look like things are trending together, but what it's measuring are things that would never be considered related. So the first name popularity of Harmony and Associates awarded in agricultural and natural resources looks like it trends pretty closely over the last 15 years, but I don't think that there's a correlate that one's causing the other. I don't think that because we named a bunch of people Harmony that everyone's going to school for natural resources. Bachelor's degree is awarded in electricity generation in Angola. We're not thinking that more people are getting interdisciplinary studies degrees because there's more electricity in Angola or vice versa. And we also don't follow the trends based on aerial and fashion designers in Michigan. So, um, in fact, I'm not really seeing if we're using Ariel as in the like Disney copyrighted and trademarked Little Mermaid. I don't know if there's a connection there. I'm trying to think of one. I can't think of one. So these are considered spurious correlations where one's not causing the other, they're just trending together for some coincidental reason. Now, going back to the discussion of political economy, if you take a class that's not economics and you talk about economics or the economy, you're going to usually think about it in the context of a political system. And so the political systems in economics stem from answering these three questions. The first question is what gets produced? The second one is how is it produced? And the third one is who gets it? So this goes back to how are resources distributed in that country? Are they distributed equally? Are they distributed based on the government? Are they distributed based on people and capital and stuff like that? Is it a combination of the two? Well, that's what we have to answer, and that's what defines our different quote unquote organizational structures. So we have three. We have a centrally planned economy, which basically says resource production or allocation and goods and service production is predominantly determined by the government. Really, the only potential example we have of that now is North Korea. The Soviet Union kind of did this too. Is it as extreme as it as it sounds like in the definition? Probably not. Were the government's extreme? Yes. But was it actually as definitively and rigidly planned as the definition suggests? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know exactly for sure because the USSR, very large population, hard to kind of enforce it all. Even though they tried very well and they were able to enforce and impose will over what are now free nations. Um, North Korea has a pretty significant lockdown, but it's also a lot smaller area, so it's a little bit easier. The complete opposite end is the market economy. And so market economies are these two actors, which we call households, which are people, and firms, which are businesses. A song and dance between the two of them basically determines how resources are distributed. Businesses need people for labor, so they pay them. They need their resources, so they pay them. Households need goods and services, which businesses make, so they pay them. So basically, there's kind of this interdependence between people and businesses to get the stuff that they need to live and survive. And so there's no image found there because there is no perfect market economy. So a lot of you might be waving your flags and saying, USA, USA, we're market economy. Or you might even think Ireland or Singapore are market economies where it's purely capitalist, purely free market. Doesn't work that way. They might trend in that direction. It's a continuum, but there's still significant enough government intervention within those systems to prevent them from being pure market economies. Most economies, if not all economies, are some semblance of a mixed economy, which is that there is a industry or two or many that are basically controlled or exercise great strength over by the government, whereas there is still a capitalist private sector household firm song and dance going on behind the scenes. So Europe is more of what we think of a mixed economy. So people think about like, okay, well, they have like healthcare that is provided by the government, or airline industries that are provided by the government, energy sectors that are run by the government. Whereas we might think that the US doesn't really have that through regulation or even through military spending and how they control those industries, we still have some significant dominion that's exercised by the US government over the economy. And so what does this all stem down to? Well, it basically allows for us to transition into what we're going to talk about kind of for the rest of the class, which is looking at the economy through the lens of markets. So markets are groups of buyers and sellers and the institutions by which they come together to trade. So markets basically can be anything where a buyer and a seller come to trade. It can be on the internet, it can be in person, it can be a parking lot, it can be Amazon or some other e-commerce website, it can be a grocery store. Wherever there's a buyer and a seller interacting and engaging in a trade that is executed, that is a market. Now, some people will say, okay, well, in order for a market system to exist or a pure market economy, there can't be government. Well, that's actually not true. So, when it comes to market economies, even if we called the US a market economy, even if we said, okay, like it's as close to a market economy as possible, you, or if we want to live in this kind of like some would call like a libertarian world where there's just like zero regulation on some sort of economic things and people can just like go to whoever's survival of the fittest in terms of the industry wins, etc., and we end up with a bunch of monopolies. Like even if we didn't, even if we did that, there would still need to be some backbone of legal structure in order for the market system to work. Because if you have the absence of government and you have the absence of that backbone, people won't participate because they don't have confidence or trust that what they're going to risk in terms of what they're giving up to get what they're gaining is actually going to come true. So in order for this to happen, there needs to be property rights and contract rights. So property rights allow for me to define what's mine, you to define what's yours, and be able to basically acknowledge that when I give something up or I gain something, that it is mine and it's not just, okay, well, I paid all this money for everybody to have it or something like that. And then secondly, there needs to be contract rights. Contract rights allow for there to be some sort of kind of arbiter of fairness if you and I enter into an agreement and one of us or both of us doesn't hold up our end of the deal. So contract rights allow for there to be some sort of arbiter that allows for there to be some sort of equitable adjudication of the contract or execution of the contract if it is not um, faithfully completed by both parties. So in the absence of those, you lose a lot of confidence. And honestly, if you take macroeconomics, you're going to learn later on that this is actually the foundation for most of the macroeconomies around the world and the differentiator between those that have become highly developed and those that are struggling to still get their footing. Doesn't mean they won't get there, but they're struggling because they might have a lack of a framework that they can build off of. So, that's a basic introduction to what you're going to get in Principles of Economics. We are a academic discipline that is focused from the concept of scarcity. Economics is basically the study of resources and their distribution in human behavior through the prism of scarcity. We basically use economic models and data to kind of figure out answers to questions, try to find solutions to problems, to be able to try and make the world a better place or make a business some more money, whatever our kind of motivation is or who we're hired by, that's kind of what we do. So if that's interesting to you, then maybe consider majoring in economics. Even if it doesn't, consider staying along for the ride, learning a little bit about yourself, learning a little bit more about the economy. Um, and I look forward to interacting with you in this course. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, contact me. Otherwise, good luck with your work as it comes.